So hello everyone and welcome back to week 7 of Java Server Pages. This week we're going to focus on a very important concept known as JDBC, or also known as Java Database Connectivity. Last week I showed you your first assignment, the part 1 of your assignment, and you will need to develop um, a web application for the first part. And for that part, you don't need to use a database. But for the second part, which is coming later, you will need to use Java database. So you will need to be familiar with that. Today, if there are any questions about assignments part 1, please do ask. And otherwise, we will start our session with this topic. At any time during the class, if there is a problem with my voice, you can't hear it, or if there is something wrong with the screen, please do let me know by writing me a text message, so that I can quickly fix things up. Okay. So we have talked about JSP in the last couple of weeks. Um, there have been many topics that we covered in JSP. Um, Actually, we talked about scriptlets, we talked about using expressions, we talked about using different ways to write Java code inside HTML in a simple way. And today we're going to start a new topic. We will talk about, mainly we will talk about JDBC, or Java Database Connectivity. But there are relevant concepts to JDBC which we have to learn, and those are servlet config and servlet context. Okay. And related to those concepts, we will learn about parameters and attributes. Okay. Let me see if there is any question. There is no question. Okay, so parameters and attributes. Last week, we learned how to set attributes in um, in JSP and how to get those attributes. Today we will learn about parameters. We will talk about the differences between parameters and attributes. And we will talk about servlet config and servlet context. So I want you to just remember these terms, and when we get back to them during the class, at least you can remember that we had this conversation, and you will learn the differences then. Okay, so without further ado, let me get to this topic: parameter types and attribute types. Okay, there are some similarities between them in a way that they both have a name and a value, but they are used differently, and the way we can access them and use them are actually different. Okay. But before going into the details of attributes, I want to give you a quick introduction of Java database programming with JDBC. I have mentioned this before, I think maybe sometimes during the first week, that what we are going to use MySQL. So let me just put this on the left. So we will use MySQL database. The reason we chose MySQL is that it's freely available for you, and using MySQL with JSP has been widely used. It's a very convenient. Basically, they match really well. Everything is available for you. I will show you how to download, install it, and how to download the driver for that. So this course is based on MySQL. Okay, if you have a valid reason for using some other databases, such as SQL Server, you can talk to me about it. I don't have any issues regarding using different databases as long as you hold yourself responsible for it, for anything that might happen during the course of your usage. So, one thing that you need to remember is that there are. So, how is my voice now? Is it clear? Okay, somebody is asking about SQL Server. Yes, you can use SQL Server. You have the choice, but I'm going to teach MySQL. It's up to you. If you want to use SQL Server, it's fine. Is that clear? So you can use SQL Server or any other databases, but we're going to talk about MySQL mostly in this course. So is everything clear now? Okay, I assume everything is clear. All right. So what you need to remember is that there are basic steps that you need to take every time you're using a database. So for example, the first thing, you have to register the driver. The driver is basically a jar file that you will need to download to your system, and then this is how you will register your class for the JDBC driver. You will use certain classes such as driver manager to establish a connection, okay? And every time you need to connect to the database, you will need to know the URL of your database, and then you will have to create a username and a password, okay? Um, so let me just quickly demonstrate what you need to do, what you need to download. So the first thing you need to download is the database itself. So if you actually, you need to find the free version of MySQL. So if you type MySQL Community Edition on your search engine, whatever you use, the Community Edition is the edition, the version that you're looking for. It's free. Okay, so you need to go to their website and you will see different packages that are available for you. So there are two ways you can do it. You can install, you can download the installer, This is basically just 2 megabytes, but then it allows you to choose a package. Or you can simply go to MySQL community server. For me, I'm a Mac user, so I chose Mac. But if you have other operating systems, you can choose the different ones. Um, Basically, you can just download a zip file, again, depending on your operating system. If you are using Ubuntu or Fedora, Linux, other operating systems, you will need to download them accordingly. The installation is very simple. However, you need to remember that somewhere during the installation, you will be asked to create a password. Okay. So your password will be used in your application, so you need to remember that. Your username by default will be root. Okay. You can certainly later create more usernames, more users, but by default, your username is root. Password you have to choose yourself. So during the installation, please remember what your password is. One more thing, you need to download. So let me go to the download page again. One more thing that you need to have is the driver, is the connector, right? Because you're connecting MySQL to Java, you will need to get a connector /j, which is basically for Java. Again, you will choose your operating system. You'll have a choice for many platforms, but in case your operating system is not selected, you can basically go ahead and choose platform independent. And then you can download your, maybe you can choose zip file, okay, which is what I did. And once you have the driver, what you will need to do is, so I copied my driver here in my home, JSP. So this is what you get. Okay, you will get a zip file, and then so as you can see, I have 2 versions basically. This is the old one that I used last year. This is the latest one, version 8.0.23. Let me see. And this is what I recommend you to download. There is a jar file that you will need to use in your application. Okay, so there are 2 ways you can either import it to your Eclipse, but the easiest way is if you go to your DOS or terminal or however you like, you can just copy it using your Windows. What you need to do is you need to copy this into your Tomcat library. If you do that, every time you load a project or create a new project, this jar file will be available to your project. Okay, so what you can do is you can copy it. Mine is called MySQL 23, MySQL jar file. I copy it to where my Tomcat is. Tomcat, and there is a folder called library. So I have already copied the file there. So every time I open my Eclipse, that jar file is available. The other thing I did is that's profile. The other thing I did here is I have set this path So if I want to use my MySQL, I don't need to provide the full path every time. Okay, this is just available. It's easy. You can do the same thing. So if I want to go to MySQL, the first thing I do is I need to um, turn on my MySQL. So if I go to the application, usually by default it starts itself, but I have stopped it manually before, so I need to start it manually again. All right. So if I click here and provide my password, um, my MySQL will start running. And the way to test it is I can just type MySQL. If you type MySQL, it won't give you access. The reason is you need to provide your username and password. So the way to start it is you say MySQL minus hyphen U. That's not actually hyphen, just minus U, and then the username is root, and then minus P. Uh, I I shouldn't type my password. Okay, so once you press enter, then it asks you your password. I'm gonna type in my password. If your password is entered correctly, you will be taken to the MySQL command line. There are certain things that you can do. For example, there are some databases that already exist. Uh, you can view them by saying show databases. So you will see this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one I created myself, but these ones are available by default. Um, if you want to create databases, create tables, I'm sure you're already familiar with the commands, and we will get back to that. But for now, let me just quit. And then once we want to create a web application with JDBC, we will come back to MySQL again. Okay, so this is it about installation. There is nothing really difficult about it, but still, if you have any questions, if you get stuck during an installation or you have some doubts, please feel free to reach out and let me know what problem you're experiencing. Okay, so there are very little that you need to remember about starting a connection, but we will get back to the coding part um, later on during the class. So in Java programming, you're always told to close the connection once you don't need it anymore. Okay, and there is a command for that, for closing the connection. You will need to remember it. Um, but there are certain questions that arise, like should I keep the connection open? How long the connection should be opened? When should I close it? And there are many questions that we will actually look for the answer during the class. The other questions that arise are, for example, where to open the connection. Okay, so if you remember the life cycle of Servlet and JSP, you know that there is a method called init that once called gives servlet features to your class. Okay, and we know that this method will be called only once. So if you have 200 users requesting a page, only the first one, for the first one, this method will be called. Okay, but do get is called per request. Okay, so for every single request, either do get or do post will be called. So this question comes to mind, where should I open my connection? There is an advanced concept called connection pooling, which we will discuss later. But let's get into, let's discuss the simple ways to open a connection in DoGet, for example. So there are some problems with having a connection opened inside a DoGet. Can anybody guess what are the problems, or can anybody tell me some problems that you can think of in opening a connection inside a DoGet? Do you think it's a good idea to have a connection opened inside a DoGet? That's my question. Do you think it's a good idea to have a connection opened inside the DoGet? Or do you think having a connection in init will be better? Any idea? Anybody? No idea? Okay, so let's go further and we will find the answer later. So this is what happens if it's inside the DoGet. You'll see that every time there is a request, there will be connection trying to establish between the servlet and the server. Okay. So this may not be a very efficient way. Okay, because opening a connection requires certain amounts of interaction between your servlet and the server, and it can be very time consuming. Okay, so you might then think of using init, because init is only called once. So you might think that, okay, if you're using init as a point, as a place to open your connection might be a better idea. So let's see. Now this time we put it inside init method. It is more efficient than using doGet, but there are still some problems when you use the init method. We'll see in a minute what those problems are. So if you have your connection inside the init method, the connection will be opened once, and next time there is a new request, you don't need to do this whole thing once again. So it will be relatively faster. Okay, the user will experience a faster response. All right. But still, there are some problems using init method, and that goes back to the problem of the connection object. Because connection object only allows one single query to be processed at a time. Okay, you cannot run two queries, three queries. Let's say you want to select some columns from a table, and you want to do the same operation three times at the same time. The connection object does not allow that. So consequently, one user can use only one connection. This means that everybody will have to queue up. Queuing up means waiting. It means decreasing the speed of response time. Okay, so this is basically a waste of time, because if there are 100 queries and 100 different users, Every user will have to wait for the other user to finish his or her query in order to be able to use the connection. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay. So then one efficient way technology to basically create connections is using connection pooling. This is a technique to manage connection objects for multiple connections. And the way it works um, is same like the concept of pooling. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of pooling. But let me explain it here, which is very simple. We will have a client, and we will have a pool of connection. So let's say we have 10 connections that are already created, okay? And every time there is a client that wants to create a connection, we simply pass one of the connections to him. Okay, he or she will use the connection, and once finished, will close the connection. But we have a number of connections that are already created. And so basically, the clients will simply borrow a connection. They will use it, and then once finished, they return it to the pool. Okay. So the idea is that application programmers, they don't have to create connections themselves. They can just borrow it from the pool. Okay. And since the connections are already created, there is no delay. Once the client wants it, he will just get an already created connection. There is no need for an application programmer to create a connection himself. Okay, so as I said before, we're going to talk about servlet config and servlet context as well. And we will see how these can be related to JDBC. So servlet config is basically, it gives us certain parameters. We can set certain parameters inside our web.xml file or deployment descriptor. For every single servlet, we can define certain parameters that are called init parameters, and they have a name and value. To see one example, let me show you this slide here. So servlet config init parameters. They're defined inside the servlet elements, inside your web.xml file. Okay, so let's say you want to have certain parameters for your servlets. Okay, you can define them here. So we have a parameter name called driver, and we have a parameter name called URL. Every parameter will have a name and a value. So it's very much like a map with a key and a value. Okay. I'm going to show you an example of how we define these parameters and how we use them in our servlet. So every servlet can have multiple init parameter, and every init parameter will have a name and a value. So in this example, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 init parameters. Okay. Then the question is, once we set those parameters, how are we going to retrieve them? And I'm going to demonstrate that for you in Eclipse in a second. So let me open my Eclipse, and we will see how to set servlet config parameters. So what you need to remember is that servlet config parameters are defined for each servlet. Okay, so I will just tell you what I mean by that. Let's go ahead and create an application, a dynamic web project. We will call it servlet config demo. Okay, I think everything else is set. Next. I will create a web.xml file myself. So this one's fine. Finish. Servlet config demo. All right. So what I need to do first is I will need to create a web.xml file. So I'll go to my web content. Where does it go? Where does web.xml go? Can you tell me? Where should I place web.xml file in my project? Anybody knows? No, where should I put it? Which folder should I put it? No, my question is where should the web.xml file go? Where should it go? Can I put it here in the source? Can I put it here? That's correct. There is a folder where you need to place your web.xml file, and that is web -inf. Okay, so here I'm going to create a new file, which is called web.xml. Okay. So let me just copy the heading part of web.xml. Let me find a recent project. Because sometimes I don't use a web.xml file, I use web annotation. So let me see. Maybe this one will have. Yes, okay, I only need this part. Okay, so I'm gonna copy it there. And then we will need servlets. Okay, let me close web app. Okay. So I will need a servlet. What I want to create, I want to create init parameters for my servlet config. Okay, so what I need to have is first we need a servlet. So let me use autocompletion. It's not available, servlet name, and we will have a servlet class. And here, here we will have, what do we need? Servlet mapping, right? Servlet mapping will have servlet name again. I'm going to copy from here. And URL pattern, right? Okay, so servlet name is going to be whatever I choose. So let's call it, the class name is, oh, not this one. The class name is, oh, we don't have a class name yet. So let's call it, the project name is servlet config demo. So I'm gonna call it SCD. We don't know the name of the class yet. But what I want to do is I want to create init parameters, okay? And this is how you will create them, init param, okay? Once you have init parameters, then let me see if no, it's not working. Init, sorry, that will be parameter name and parameter value. Param name and param value, okay? Let's say I want to have two init parameters, okay? Let's say I have parameter name first name, and the second parameter is my surname. Let's say whatever the first name, Alex. Yeah, just a random name. So we have two parameters, two init parameters. Let me space this out, tab, indented properly. Okay, so now we're going to create a servlet class and we will fill the rest of the information. Definitely servlet name for servlet mapping is going to be scd. Okay, so now I'm going to create a servlet. The servlet, I'm going to call it what do we call it? Display init param. Display init param. Okay. Anything else we need to do? No, I'm not going to define a package, so it will go inside the default package. I only need do get. I might use init as well. So now we have some information. Because I'm using web.xml, I don't need to use annotation, right? So I'm going to comment this line out. What I need to copy from here is the name of my class, which is display init param, and I will copy it right here. Okay, display init param. If you find that there are any problems, please let me know. URL pattern. Anybody knows how to name this? What should I write here? Any idea? You can type any name, but you have to start with a /. Okay, so we can call it display I init param. I'm gonna make it shorter, display init parameter IP. Okay. I think there is nothing else we need to worry about now. The servlet is closed properly. The servlet mapping is also correct. The names match. Here's the name of a class, so I think everything's correct. So let's go to our servlets. Now the question is, how do we retrieve those parameters inside a servlet? Obviously, you can do it here. You can do it inside your inits, whichever way you want. But if you're doing it inside your inits, you can only use system.out because you don't have the response object. Okay. So what you need to do is you will need to define a servlet config object. So I'm going to say C, and then you say get servlet config. This is gonna get you the servlet config, okay? And your servlet config object will have all the contents of your web.xml file. And this is related only to this servlet, which is display init param. So I'm going to use C. But the thing is, you can see that config is already available here. So you don't really need to do this. Okay. Your config is already available here. If you're doing it in dget, then you will need to get that object. So I can just simply say config dot get init parameter names. Okay, this is going to return an enumeration. Okay, so I'm gonna create a data type enumeration. We call it params. It's underlined red because we haven't imported the right package, which I'm going to do in a second. That's java.util.enumeration. So you're going to see that this line is just added automatically. And then I will need to have a loop because we have multiple parameters, right? So I'm gonna need to have a while loop. We'll say params dot has more elements. So if you remember earlier, when we were retrieving parameters from an HTML form, we did a very similar thing. We didn't use the config. If you remember, we were also using parameters to get your request parameters, okay? We did a very similar thing to collect the form parameters and then use a loop to go through them. This is very similar, except that we have to use a config object, okay? So while I'm going to get one of the parameters, params dot next element, okay, this is going to return an object, okay? So if I want to store it as a string, let's call it p, this is going to be a problem because I need to convert that or typecast it to a string because this next element returns an object. Next thing, I can just simply system.out.println because we're inside init method. We don't have access to response object. Okay. So what I'm going to say is parameter whatever. So the name of the parameter is we already have it. P, right? Has the following value. And the value of it is we get it from the config.get init parameter. This time we know the name of it, so we can use init parameter. If we don't know the names of the parameters, we have to collect them first. Okay, so this is it, really. There is nothing else you need to do to retrieve the parameter names. Now I can run this applications and see if we can retrieve. Oh, actually, let me just. No, that's fine. Let me just see. Check. We need to get two parameters, Alex, and then query. So let's see. Okay, because I use the init method, my parameters are going to be printed here, right? So because I use system.out, this is my first parameter. So parameter first name, parameter surname. Okay, and the names have been retrieved. The question is, how can we retrieve these parameters inside our JSP? So if you remember, earlier we talked about JSP lifecycle, and we learned that actually JSP will later be converted to a servlet. So the question is, can we access servlet context from a JSP? And the answer is yes. There is a little difference, as instead of using, so let me just copy this information here, down below. And I want to create the same parameter for a JSP, right? But there will be a difference. The difference is that instead of servlet name, for JSP, we will have a JSP file. Okay, so let's see how it works. We have servlet name, but let me go, where's the new one that I copied? Okay, that's the one. So we have servlet name, but instead of servlet class, because we don't have a servlet class, we will have JSP file. So this is going to be JSP hyphen file, JSP file. So we don't know the name of it yet. So let's go ahead and create a JSP, and then we will come back here. Where does the JSP go? The JSP will go inside our web content in web INF. So I can just right click here, new, where's JSP? Right here. We can call this one, let's say, config demo. Okay, so now let's go back. Now we know the name of our JSP. Please remember that instead of servlet class, we have JSP file. And I'm going to provide the name here, which is config-demo.jsp. And I will do it with a forward slash. Obviously, we have to give it a different name because we already have a servlet name with this name. We can call it JSP config demo. Okay. And then I'm going to use the same name again. Where in servlet mapping, this name, I'm gonna have a URL pattern. This one will be JSP config demo. You can give any name again. Okay, I think everything else is fine. What we can do is we can change this name this time. I'm gonna give a different name so we can really separate them out. How do we retrieve these parameters inside the JSP? We will see that after the break. Okay, so please take 10 minutes. We're going to come back and find out how to do it in JSP.